It's NightSide with Dan Rea on WBZ, Boston's News Radio.
All right, welcome back. Thank you very much, Dan Watkins. We interviewed briefly about a week and a half ago my next guest. Her name is Nicklin. She's an internationally best-selling author of a book called Softening the Edge, founder of the world's first organizational empathy platform, EmpathyEverywhere.co. Mimi Nicklin, welcome back to Nightside. How are you?
I'm so happy to be back, Dan. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Very welcome. So, since I see it's EmpathyEverywhere.co, I'm assuming that is European or perhaps even a British website.
Well, it's actually global. You know, now, Dan, there's so many websites in the world. Yeah. You have to limit your choices to the .coms. But I'm actually based in Asia. So I'm based in Malaysia, and I travel back and forwards to the U.S. many times a year.
So how did you get into this area of empathy? Because it leads into what we're going to talk about, which is the fact that young people seem to be disenfranchised as a result of this annual poll that is done by Gallup every year. And it's, I guess they call it the World Happiness Poll. But I'm just curious, how did you develop an expertise? I know that you speak. I know that obviously you're an author. You've published, and you've got a lot of backstory. But how does one become, in effect, an empathy advocate?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Dan, because this certainly wasn't my dream or life plan. You know, yeah. I worked in corporate my whole career, predominantly for American businesses within the marketing field. And then in 2018, I got offered a managing director role in Dubai, in the Middle East. And I moved to Dubai, which is a very modern, global city. But when I arrived in that city, the business I had gone there to take over, to be on the safe side, let's just say, was significantly underperforming compared to the business I had potentially believed I was entering. And the truth was, Dan, I was extremely overwhelmed. I had come from very corporate roles where there are 10 people in finance and procurement, and, you're surrounded by leadership teams. And I turned up in this company of about 40 people, and overnight was sort of made to become an entrepreneur, a small business owner, really. And I remember thinking, well, I don't know how to turn this around. I don't have the skills to do this. And at the time, I met with a business coach to get some advice on what was going on in the region and why the business was struggling as it was. And she asked me about my leadership style. And at the time, I remember telling her that I was using a lot of intuition, that I was an intuitive leader. And she stopped me, Dan, and she asked me a question which, in the end, changed my life. Because she said, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And I thought to myself, no, it's not empathy. I mean, it can't be empathy. What's empathy got to do with the corporate world? But, Dan, after that lunch, I went away and started studying empathy. And I discovered something called the empathy deficit, which was coined by Barack Obama in 2006. And the honest truth is, Dan, once I discovered the size of this challenge in the world, I couldn't believe that more people weren't talking about it. So from that day onwards in 2018, I made it my mission, as it were, to get up every day and educate the world on what empathy is. And I have been doing that for 5 years, and last year we managed to reach 5 million people with this mission. So it's grown significantly since the beginning.
So explain to us what I mean, I understand what empathy is, I think, intellectually. You probably understand that at a much greater depth than I do. Any politician they love to coin a phrase. So if former President Obama coined the phrase empathy deficit, that sounds like something a politician would come up with, because politicians are always talking about financial deficits, and people understand what a deficit is. And if you attach a different word to it, now instead of becoming the budget deficit, it's an empathy deficit. So you think about it, well, we're lacking something. That means we're Explain to us in a better way, in your terminology, what is the empathy deficit in your mind? I mean, I think all of us are overwhelmed at this point. We want to be empathetic, but we're struggling with our own lives and our own sets of circumstances. So help me out here and my audience to better understand it. And then I want to talk to you about this Gallup poll, which suggests that a lot of young people are not very happy these days, and try to figure that out. And if we can solve all those problems by the time the end of the hour comes along, I'll consider it a pretty successful hour. Go right ahead. Explain to us empathy deficit. What are we talking about? Is it the sort of thing that you walk past someone on the street who you know is you don't even want to exchange glances with them, because is that the sort of empathy we're talking about?
Look, Dan, the reality, and you touch on a very important insight here, which is that most people actually don't know what empathy is. There is a lot of misunderstanding as to the definition of empathy. So empathy at its simplest is about perspective taking. It is simply the ability to understand how somebody else sees the same thing that you do differently. And the key thing with empathy is that it's not about judgment or agreement. So you can understand somebody else's opinion or reality without agreeing with it, without liking it. You know, Dan, you could say something to me tonight that I really dislike, but I can understand. I can understand why you're saying that, even if I don't like it, right? So empathy is the ability to understand that perspective of another. It is not the same as sympathy, which is an emotion, right? The feeling of pity for someone, or compassion, which is an action. Empathy is a skill set. It sits in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. You were born with it. So probably the question I get asked most is, but Mimi, don't you just have more empathy than everybody else? But the answer is no. We all have the same amount of empathy. It's built into the brain because we are a pro-social species. So this is a survival mechanism, because as humans, as tribes, you know, we came from tribes in the plains of Africa, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago, wherever we all came from, we came from tribes of people. We do better when we are together. So this is a skill set that not only helps us thrive, right? Helps us do better and work in teams and work in community and heal better, have better health, but it helps us survive. So when we talk just now in a minute about the Gallup study and what happiness is and what that means, fundamentally, if we are not seen and heard, we don't do well. Our entire nervous system changes. You see immunity go down. You see chronic disease go up. Dan, two babies that are born equally sick, the one that gets more empathy outlives the other. And the last thing I would say is, according to the Surgeon General last year in the U.S., to be chronically lonely, so to be disconnected to others over the long term, is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this disconnection, this loneliness, is killing us.
Well, you know, I've been doing a talk show now for 19 years, after having been an on-air reporter for the CBS affiliate here in Boston for 31 years.
Wow.
I was your hard-charging 6 and 11 o'clock news reporter, did stories which got innocent people out of jail, did stories which put criminals in jail, including a very highly well-known politician who's ran for president for many years here in the States. Story for another night. But I do a lot of politics on this show, and of course I get people from both extremes, and I'm kind of a right of center guy. I believe in things like order and rules and regulations. I'm trained as a lawyer, so that makes you kind of very much in that category. And when I get people call up and they're criticizing, someone, whomever, and how could they possibly? And I always say, look, it's their life experience which has got them to this point. It's their point of view. They're not a bad person, even though they disagree with your point of view on a bunch of ideas. So I don't know if that's being empathetic or not, but I'm trying to basically bridge that gap in this program and say all points of view should be respected. You don't have to concede or give up, but understand that we all come from different sets of experiences. And even when you think about people who have come from extreme differences, we had segregation in this country for many, many, many years, even after the Civil War. And people who were born in certain regions of the country, that's the only thing they knew, and they didn't understand how people of different backgrounds could get along. And you got to understand that, the way people are brought up and the way they're trained and what they're taught, all of that, in my opinion, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an expert at anything, to be honest with you, but I do believe that I can facilitate conversations between people with different viewpoints, and maybe that's one type of empathy.
I totally is. And, I am in love with the medium of radio, Dan. I mean, I think maybe that makes me a little old-fashioned because the whole world wants to talk about video and even podcasts, right? But I just cannot move away from a love of this exact medium for the reason you just said. Because what you are doing is facilitating exactly that, is empathy, right? The ability to sit or drive or run and listen to the opinions of people that may not be your own. As humans, we will always default to safety, right? Because our reptilian brain, our evolutionary brain, exists to keep you alive, right? Yes. To make sure that you survive.
Sure.
And in so doing, it will revert to like when there is lack of comfort or fear. What that means is, in times of tumultuousness, whether that's political or war or social crisis, when we are uncomfortable, naturally we will revert to the people like us, that look like us, eat like us, pray like us, celebrate like us, whatever that is, right? Mm-hmm. But this is one of the biggest challenges that we face in our times. The world is extremely tumultuous all of the time. And what that's meaning is that we are seeing segregation go up because people are reverting to their cocoons, right, to their safe spaces. If we do not engage with people that are not like us, or even just people that see things differently, children, for example, children see things very differently from us, right? It
Sure.
doesn't always have to be politics or race or any of these big things, just people that are different from you. If you cannot spend time seeing things through the eyes of another, we cannot grow, we cannot connect. And what we know is that when empathy goes down, and again, as a reminder, we're just talking about understanding. When understanding decreases, the isms, racism, ageism, sexism, anyism, go up. And that is what we're seeing today, right? We're seeing the most segregated world we've ever had. And of course, nobody wins. Economically, policy-wise, health-wise, socially. The highest burden on our healthcare system worldwide today is no longer cancer or diabetes or heart disease. It's loneliness. So, yes, I absolutely agree. What you are doing is facilitating empathy of every minute that you're on air, and how wonderful is that?
Well, I appreciate that. Let me take a break because we want to make a couple of dollars here with a couple of commercials, and we'll get back. If folks would like to, again, we're talking at kind of the philosophical level. everybody. So we will get to this Gallup World Opinion poll that they've taken periodically over the last few years, and they find that there are some societies where people are happier than in other societies. We'll get to all of that. Primarily, the question is, why are young people today, people who are in that young cohort, less happy than people 10 years or 20 years ago who are of then the same age as they are today? I have thoughts on it. I suspect Mimi has better thoughts, and hopefully you have some thoughts. So if you'd like to join the conversation, you know the numbers. I'll give them out later, but I'll let it go for now. In the meantime, if you'd like to get on early and you know the numbers, feel free. We'll take a quick break. I'll be back with my guest, Mimi Nicklin, a global empathy advocate and author, basically focusing on human connections, which are so important and so critical. Back on NightSide right after this.
It's NightSide with Dan Rea on WBZ, Boston's News Radio.
My guest is Mimi Nicklin. She is an empathy advocate, best-selling author, and we are the book that she wrote, Softening the Edge. We'll get to that a little bit. But I'd like to get to this Gallup poll. It's a worldwide poll of happiness, particularly happiness levels of young adults. And the poll finds that young adults, despite all of the connectivity that they have at their fingertips, literally worldwide, they are less happier today than they were when 10 years ago, when another cohort of young people also took this poll. So why is it that people generally, and I guess there are some countries where people are skewing towards happiness, we can get to that, but in the U.S., young people are not as happy, of similar age. They should be, I think, happy in their 20s. They probably don't have a lot of the responsibilities that ultimately come along in terms of renting or buying a house, deciding whether they want to get married, whether they want to have children, what sort of a career path. There's a lot of big decisions you have to make once you graduate from college. What's driving this, Mimi? We got to get to a newscast at 9:30, so we got a couple of minutes here. Let's just set the table. What is driving this level of unhappiness? We're going in the wrong direction. The more toys we have to play with, the less happy we seem to be.
Yeah, perhaps it's exactly that, Dan. I mean, what that recent data from Gallup shows is that young people are reporting lower happiness than those previous generations, which aligns with exactly what I'm seeing in my work globally, which is that we are surrounded by communication, by visibility, and we often confuse the difference between being visible and being actually understood or connected. So over 50% of people in the USA, 52% to be specific, report feeling lonely. Engagement in workplaces, whether that's your first job or later in your career, sits at only 20%, which means that 80% of people are not happy in their work, right? They're turning up, they're doing their job, they're going home. And as we spoke about earlier, that loneliness is reducing life expectancy. So this is not just about mindset. I think often when we look at this data, we think it's always about mindset and how we think and feel, but actually it's a human connection issue. So is it social media's fault? I don't think so. I think it's very easy to blame social media, but it's missing the real issue. Platforms amplify human behavior. They don't create it. So if we bring that distraction and poor listening and comparison to those platforms, they're going to scale it. So they could easily, just as easily, scale empathy and belonging and connection if we allow them to.
Well, is it possible that with the idealistic or the idealism that exists on platforms, everybody's beautiful, everybody seems to be happy, and when we compare ourselves to the people who we see on these platforms, they've always been movie stars, but I think that everybody knew that, well, back in the day, if it was Marilyn Monroe or whomever it was, they were a cut above. No one figured that they could be anywhere nearly as attractive as the great movie stars or back of the 50s or the 60s. But now you look at everybody who's trying to be an influencer. They have followers. Are we comparing ourselves to people that it's just so many people? It's unrealistic to think that we can achieve the notoriety, the celebrity, if you will, of all these ordinary people who become superstars on computers and on the internet.
I think it definitely plays a role, but I think it's probably not just the existence of the influencers, because as you said, for decades and decades and decades, we've always looked up to film stars and Hollywood movie stars. So it's not the existence of the influencers that creates the problem, but the volume of that unfiltered comparison. But critically, Dan, combined with the fact that these young people have a lack of real-world recognition. So what happens is that those young people are measuring their lives against these highly curated versions of success without enough grounded feedback about their own value in the real world. And that would come back again to some of these issues around connection, but also the fundamental decline of family strength, the strength of family units, the decline in religion across many parts of the world, not because of the religion themselves, but because fundamentally when we had higher numbers of people in faith-based, they had access to faith-based environments, they found leadership. Now, if these, again, that doesn't matter whether it is, Christian or Muslim or Hindu, it doesn't matter what faith it is. But when people have strong family units and an access to leadership in their communities and social lives, they are able to look at some of these influences and people of influence and understand their context from their own. So I think that it is a very multifaceted reality which fundamentally comes back to a lack of leadership at home, in community, and at work.
Okay, we'll pause on that. When we come back, we'll get to some phone calls. I'll invite people to join the conversation. I think it's interesting that the media did a lot in the 1970s and 80s to destroy any form of faith. I remember Time in Newsweek, Is God Dead? And the philosophers out there who were saying there's nothing beyond this. And the one thing that religions do, whatever the religion is, it gives people some hope that there might be something beyond this veil of tears. I can't prove that. No one can disprove it to me. I don't know if you're religious or not. It doesn't matter. But I think the point you make is that religion does give people a hope, an aspirational hope that no matter how bad things are here, maybe they could get better, and maybe they could even get better beyond here. I'm probably not making sense to you, but we'll continue our conversation right after the news break at the bottom of the hour. 617-254-1030, 617-931-1030. My name is Dan Rea. My guest is Mimi Nicklin. She's an empathy advocate, author. Her book, Softening the Edge. We will talk with her for the balance of the hour, and I hope you will join us with your perspectives coming back on NightSide. We've been a little philosophical. We'll get down to the street level as well right after the break.
You're on NightSide with Dan Rea on WBZ, Boston's News Radio.
My guest is Mimi Nicklin. She's an empathy advocate, author of a book, Softening the Edge. She also has been a speaker around the world. She sort of came to this. She didn't major in this in college, but it is clearly, when you listen to her passion in life. Mimi, let's see if we get some callers going here and seeing if they how happy they are in their lives. I'd love to particularly hear from young callers. I mean, the 20s, which is, I think, the time frame that Gallup polled here. It's a tumultuous time in people's lives. Many people aren't exactly sure what they're going to be doing, where they're going to be living. So I assume that feeling of tumult has to contribute to that feeling of discomfort or lack of focus. Am I reading that correctly?
I think so. I mean, I think at that time of life, so much is changing, right? So there is, and especially now when we look at, cost of living crisis, the availability of jobs, the fear of AI, and we often forget that the human brain doesn't actually complete its development until we're 25 years old. So, we think that children stop being children at, 18, 19, 20 years old, but they're still developing into those mid-20s. And as we mentioned earlier, Dan, there's a lot going on out there in the world for them to reckon with.
I couldn't agree with you more. Let me get to some phone calls. 617-254-1030, 617-931-1030. If you have a question for Mimi Nicklin, you are more than welcome. She will stay with us until 10 o'clock. Let me go first to Shane in Weymouth, Massachusetts. Shane, if I recall, you're a fairly young guy, right?
In age and spirit, not so much, but yes.
Well, what's the age?
I am the bottom half of my 30s.
Bottom half of your 30s. Okay, I don't know how to define bottom half, but you're in your 30s.
The younger half.
So you're somewhere below 35. You're on the right side of 35. Okay. Are you happier today than you were 4 or 5 years ago? I'm just asking you that question, and then I'll give you to talk to Mimi and ask whatever questions you want. Are you feeling better about yourself today, now in your 30s, than you did in your 20s?
No. No, I'm not.
You're not?
Thank God I can laugh at it.
Okay, no problem. Do you have any idea why you're feeling a little less confident or whatever? How would you describe what you're feeling like at this point? Is it a question of confidence? Is it a question of security? Your occupation?
So, in my personal life, I stepped away from all of this, from politics, for a long time. As you can probably tell, I'm a fairly political guy. I eat, sleep, and breathe politics because I found a wonderful relationship that I managed to torpedo after 4 years.
Okay,
so
well, maybe you weren't ready. What's your question? Talk to the expert here, because maybe Mimi has some answers for you. I think that's an interesting acknowledgement that you just made, which is probably helpful. Mimi, say hello to Shane from Weymouth.
Hello, Shane. How are you? It's lovely to meet you. Tell me, what's your question? How can I help?
Beautiful accent. It's lovely to meet you too, Mimi. So, as a mental health worker, I think empathy advocacy is great, and I wish there was an empathy test the state could actually make anybody trying to enter the field of human services take, especially that they're mandated reporters. But I am curious if you think we're equipped to deal with some of the potential reasons, even if they're counterintuitive reasons, that we find ourselves being unhappy. I know there was that Harvard study that was turned into a book called Bowling Alone, where that found that individuals that were living in diverse neighborhoods didn't associate with their neighbors as much, and overall they thought their study was going to find the inverse, that the more rich in culture and difference that an area produced, that would in fact mean people were less bigoted, less unhappy, less anxious ridden, and it proved the exact opposite. So that basic things that aren't even in the ether of things we haven't even considered are there for us to look at if we want to raise the happiness levels. I mean, we can look at countries in the world that have a net positive amount of children being created and not just imported at slave, wages. And the only first world country that does is Israel. And the answer is simple. It's because Western countries are programmed from the top down, bottom up, to have a deep sense of guilt if you are a Westerner, to view your lineage, your ancestry as shameful. And I think, if we have to
Shane, I know you got a question here, so at the risk of...
So are we prepared to address the root causes?
I think, Shane, it's a phenomenal question. I feel like we could talk probably for 3 hours on the depth of that question. But a couple of things that come to mind. I think when you talk about the West versus the East, I live in the East. I live in Malaysia, in Asia. One of the things I would say is that Eastern societies tend to be more collectivist, and the Western societies tend to be more individualistic. And that does absolutely affect our happiness. So you mentioned there a Harvard study. There was another study by Harvard which was called the Harvard Study of Adult Development, and it's one of the longest studies that has ever existed. It ran, I think it's still running, for over 80 years. That's 80 years. And what that study actually found is that the clearest path to happiness over nearly 100 years is the quality of our relationships. That is above and beyond the strongest predictor of happiness, of health, and of longevity, well beyond money or IQ or status. So in the end, what the robust findings of that study show is that happiness is social. And that's why Dan and I have been speaking this hour about the role of connection. And, of course, empathy is the core of that.
And to look at the countries in East Asia that are suffering, they're essentially vassal states of the United States, Japan and Korea, and it's terrible. And despite what's going on geopolitically right now, I kind of hope Japan does reassert its own independence, because it's dying under, like the kind of culture that's basically being imposed on it from Washington.
Well, that gets into deep politics here, because obviously there were decisions made in the wake of World War II as to how Japan was going to govern itself and also be governed. So I understand what you're saying there, but I would say that when you pick South Korea and Japan, those are two pretty good countries to live in compared to some of the other countries.
I agree.
That exist over there. For example, North Korea and China would be an example. Hey, Shane, I got to run here because I'm way past my break. You raise good points. Thank you for answering my questions honestly. Okay.
Yeah, and great guest.
All
Thank
right.
you guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shane. Talk to you later. Good night. 617-254-1030, 617-931-1030. My guest is Mimi Nicklin, and if you'd like to talk with Mimi, she's an empathy advocate. She's explained empathy, I think, brilliantly. She's an author of a book called Softening the Edge. She did not start out to become an empathy advocate, but she believes that we need to have more empathy in our lives, and I guess part of that is to look beyond our own set of circumstances and try to understand other people's circumstances and conditions, which I think is important. We'll take more phone calls if you care to join us, and then we will change topics at the top of the hour. 617-254-1030, 617-931-1030. Back on NightSide right after this.
You're on NightSide with Dan Rea on WBZ, Boston's News Radio.
My guest is Mimi Nicklin. Mimi, I want to pick up a point that you made earlier, and that links religion or a belief in something bigger than ourselves with the concept of empathy. I didn't ask you, and you don't have to tell me whether or not you consider yourself formally religious or not. It doesn't matter. But all religions that I think that I'm aware of do preach a form of empathy that people should feel towards their fellow man. Whether it's, love thy neighbor as you love yourself, or love thy neighbor as you would love God, which I think are the basic tenets of most religions. I'm not an expert in religions other than the one that I practice, and I'm not even an expert in that. But is the fact that we as a society have fallen away from religion and the familiarity of religion and the going to church once a week, etc., and we're not having those thoughts reinforced in our mind in a religious setting, has that contributed to the lack of empathy, do you think, or no?
I think that it's very intertwined, Dan, and I think it's not necessarily about the belief system itself. And I would agree that, and I have the luck that I get to work across probably 30 countries every year. So I get to work within probably more or less every major religion around the world. I get to learn And I have the same understanding as you, that in the end, whichever God you worship, whatever faith you have, empathy, the ability to understand and connect with your fellow humans, is the same in every religion, right? So I don't think it's the belief systems disappearing per se. It's about what those systems provide. Because for many young people, it would be the same for older people, religion or faith provides structure. It provides shared identity, regular gatherings, like that built-in sense of belonging. And when that declines and it's no longer replaced with something in its place, you don't just lose tradition or faith, but you lose that consistent, meaningful connection with a community where you belong. So when you look at the data around that, and there's data from people like Pew Research Center, they show that there's a steady rise of people identifying as unaffiliated, particularly amongst younger generation, and that shift often correlates with lower participation in community-based activities. So, yes, from an empathy perspective, the impact is very clear. When there are fewer spaces where people feel known and connected and part of something bigger than themselves, that human need for belonging goes unmet.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on another point, and that is that you made, that so many people, you said, default to it. And I think Shane's point about how that there was a study, I think, that he referred to, that in more diverse communities, people were not taking advantage of that diversity, that they were sort of defaulting to folks who were like them. You would assume that if you were living closer to people of different backgrounds, you'd share information and you'd become friends. But if the study that he was referring to was correct, it would almost, I guess, support that adage that familiarity breeds contempt, which is a horrible way of saying kind of the same thing that he did, but saying it in shorthand, that as opposed to familiarity breeding friendship, and empathy and understanding, if that study was accurate, it's doing just the opposite. And I see it on my show in that people who call and have a particular political point of view, they don't take advantage of watching stations with whom they might disagree. They're very much more comfortable sitting in front of the tube and going to that political or philosophical silo with which they are comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, Dan, it goes back to that point we made probably 40 minutes ago, which is that our brain is wired for safety and for comfort in many ways. So the research that Shane, I believe, was referring to, the Harvard research by a gentleman named Robert Putnam, what his research showed was, yes, in the short term, more diverse communities do often show lower levels of trust and social cohesion because, of course, we don't understand each other. That can be intimidating or scary. So I resort to my home, my Netflix, my dinner, because I can control that, right? But actually in that research, what Putnam showed was that it's not about, diversity is a negative thing by any means, but that when you don't have connection skills, when you don't know how to say hello and make eye contact and listen first, those communities don't work. But when you do, diverse societies show more strength, more innovation, and more success. So it's always, the way you read this research is always a fine line. Fundamentally, if we know how to communicate and connect, whether that's with religion or otherwise, every community gets stronger, success, growth, even economic development improves.
Mimi, I really enjoyed our hour. I'm so glad we did it. How can folks get your books, learn more about you, contact you? Is there an easy website that you could recommend?
Yes, I would love to connect with your listeners, Dan. Thank you. My website is www.empathyeverywhere.co, or they can find me at Mimi Nicklin everywhere on social media. My most recent book is called Empathy at Work, and it's available on Amazon, and my new book will be out later in the summer.
Well, Mimi, I thank you so much. I know our connection is wonderful here. You're in Malaysia. I'm back in Boston and close to Boston anyway. Thank you for joining us tonight. It was a great connection. The quality of the audio was wonderful, and I just wanted to say thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. You've given us a lot to think about, which I think is
I so appreciate joining you. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to all the listeners. It's been wonderful to be in Boston this evening.
You certainly were. And you were all over the United States, too. Thanks, Mimi. I appreciate it so much. Mimi Nicklin, Global Empathy Advocate. When we get back, I want to talk about a story that I saw in the New York Times in the last day or so. The guy that is accused of starting the Palisades fire that killed 12 people and destroyed, 1,200 properties in Palisades, California. Big admirer of Luigi Mangione. This is a fascinating story about two young people who really have some issues if they are guilty of what they have been accused. We'll be back on NightSide right after the 10 o'clock news.